An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken to the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." So I'm entitling my presentation today, "Out of Egypt I called my son, Cradle of the Christian Tradition." So my colleague Dr. Robinson was focusing on the biblical narrative of Israel and Egypt, the plagues, the Exodus, and so on and so forth. I'm moving beyond the biblical narrative, and I'm talking about the emergence of the Christian tradition from one of its cradles, Egypt. We may or may not realize that Christianity, in fact, contrary to some popular notions, is not a Western European religion. I'm always disappointed when I hear Christianity referred to as a Western European religion. Sometimes when world religions are covered even in the classroom, some instructors are wont to say, well, there's really no need to cover Christianity, right? Because everyone knows about Christianity. We're Americans, this is a Christian culture, everybody knows about that. I'm hoping to challenge you and inspire you, enlighten you, that actually the Christian tradition, though it might seem oh so close and familiar, can be made alien and strange and something that we know nothing about. "Out of Egypt I called my son." The passage from Matthew that I read to you is a passage from the Gospel of Matthew. It references when Joseph and Mary took the child Jesus and fled to Egypt in order to find safety in Egypt. I'm using this reference from, in fact, the prophet Hosea in chapter 11, verse 1, as a kind of poetic way at getting at the emergence of later Christian tradition from one of its earliest cradles, Egypt. Christianity being, in fact, a Near Eastern religion. So I'm starting at some of the early religious history in Egypt, but I'm only pausing briefly before I move on. I'm referencing one particular text known popularly as the Book of the Dead, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This was commonly used, scholars believe, from approximately 1550 BC to 50 BC. It was in common use. The text reflects a notion in Egypt of the afterlife. This is not Israelite religion, this is Egyptian religion. They did have a belief in the afterlife, that the soul departs from the body, that the soul encounters various challenges, and the greatest sort of defining moment of the soul as it has departed from the body and goes into the afterlife that will decide the eternal fate of the soul is a weighing on the scales of justice. The heart of the person is placed on scales. And so I've given you two ancient Egyptian images of the heart on one side and the feather on the other side. If the heart outweighed the feather, the soul was condemned to a terrifying fate. But if the heart was lighter than the feather, not being burdened down with evil, nefarious ways, then the soul could pass in safety to a promising afterlife. This was sort of at the heart of this notion of Egyptian afterlife. Enter Alexander the Great. Coming out from Macedonia, he goes out on a worldwide sort of conquering endeavor. He ends up coming to Egypt, coming to the temple of the god Ammon. He hears from one of the priests there, "You are the son of Ammon." he identifies the Egyptian god Ammon with the god that he knows as Zeus. And he is told there at this temple, "You are the son of Ammon, the son of Zeus. Alexander is the son of God." And he has this divine sense of mission, that he's out on a mission from God. And he founds a city in Egypt that he cleverly names after himself, Alexandria. Alexandria, founded in approximately 332 BC, becomes one of the greatest intellectual centers in the ancient world, unrivaled by any other ancient city. At Alexandria is founded a great library. This library has the patronage of the Ptolemies. This library intentionally seeks out texts from many cultures, many different traditions. An intellectual richness and diversity is collected and housed at Alexandria, being one of the first recorded libraries that represents this ideal that we now see, that is the ideal of this library and every other library, to go out and collect these texts that represent this diversity of different cultures, different beliefs. Whatever wisdom, whatever knowledge, whatever sort of culture and society is out there, it's gathered to this intellectual center in Alexandria. Egypt becomes an intellectual heart of the ancient world. And so, in the process of gathering all of this diversity and the wisdom of these different cultures, what do they wish to acquire? But none other than the wisdom of the Hebrews. There is a tradition represented in the ancient text known as the Letter of Orestes that purports to recount events from the 3rd century BC. According to the tradition, Ptolemy asks for a translation into Greek of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so the call goes out for Jewish scholars to come and to translate their Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. Enter the first time the Bible is translated. The first tradition of my son being called out of Egypt that I want to point out to you is biblical translation finds its start in Egypt. The Hebrew Scriptures are translated into Greek. According to the tradition, 70, or in some accounts, 72 Jewish scholars come, and they are miraculously inspired by their God to translate their Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. One very famous example of this that I want to draw to your attention is in the prophet Isaiah. The Hebrew is ambiguous in a particular prophecy that says, "The young woman shall conceive and bear a son." As the Jewish translator is about to translate this into Greek, he receives a revelation, and God says, "Do not simply translate this as young woman, but translate this as virgin, a woman who has never known a man, will bear a son." And so this tradition becomes incorporated into the Christian tradition. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. This is an ancient depiction of the account where the 70 or 72 Jewish scholars come to Ptolemy, receiving his patronage to translate their scriptures into Greek. In Egypt, there is a famous Jewish scholar, one Jew in Egypt that came to be a place of, you may or may not realize this, the largest concentration of Jewish people outside of the land of Israel itself, in Egypt. Ironically, the very place from which they came in the Exodus becomes the largest homeland for the Jewish people outside of Israel itself. One of the scholars of note from ancient Egypt, known as Philo of Alexandria, living from 20 BC to 50 AD, Sometimes it's thought maybe 40 AD, but living approximately at that time. Philo knew the scriptures in the Greek translation. The Greek translation being known as the Septuagint. Septuagint coming from the Greek word for 70, by the way. 70, the translation of the 70. And so Philo, reading the scriptures in Greek, takes up an Alexandrian tradition. There is an Alexandrian tradition of interpreting the writings of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, especially the Odyssey, using an interpretive technique known as the allegorical interpretation of Scripture. The first tradition coming out of Egypt that I wanted to call your attention to was the tradition of Bible translation. The second tradition coming out of Egypt that I want to draw your attention to is interpretation of Scripture using the allegorical approach. Philo of Alexandria is a Jew par excellence in using the allegorical interpretation of Scripture. He takes the familiar stories of Noah and the flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 patriarchs, the Exodus, and he offers these narratives a new, sort of rich, spiritual, allegorical interpretation that is later taken up by the Christians and used prolifically by Christians. This method of not only Bible translation, but Bible interpretation becomes part of the quintessence of the later Christian tradition. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. One of the profound Christians in Egypt to take up the allegorical interpretation of Scripture was named Origen. He's known as Origen of Alexandria, living from approximately 185 to 254 AD. Origen becomes one of the first sustained, intellectual, brilliant, have to underscore that, brilliant interpreters of Scripture in the allegorical method. His ideas and interpretations of the Scriptures become seminal, pregnant with so many of the ideas that would later come to define the Christian tradition in its more mystical and spiritual aspects. In Egypt at this same time, there rose up an ascetical tradition. The Greek word askesis does not mean, and do not allow anyone to fool you, it does not mean self-denial. Sometimes you'll hear people define asceticism as denying oneself. What a dreadful thought. From the Greek word askesis, it means exercise. It comes from the way training for the Olympian Games was described. If you are training for the Olympics, you practice askesis. You train yourself for excellence. The ascetical tradition was training for excellence in the spiritual life. St. Anthony the Great is the most famous of those practicing askesis in Egypt. Training for excellence in the spiritual life, associated with the broader tradition of what were known as the Desert Fathers, the monks, those who formed monasteries, those that turned away from the blessings and the good things in marriage and raising children in order to, with a single-minded focus and devotion, turn their gaze upon God. This was their focus. The exteriors of self-denial are simply accidents. The essence, what they were up to, was not so much shunning the world, but seeking to focus their attention upon God. Origen wrote a commentary on the biblical book known as the Song of Songs. This is a romance poem from the Hebrew Scriptures. And Origen, interprets the Song of Songs as a romance poem, as the romance between a human person and God. And this sort of romance, this desire for God as the one and only, becomes this defining tradition in Egypt. The tradition of Anthony the Great and the Desert Fathers becomes sort of exemplified in the Desert Father known as Athanasius. Again, notice where he's from, of Alexandria. Living from approximately 296 to 376, Athanasius is best known for clarifying the teaching: Christ is fully God and fully human. What does this mean? This is the third tradition that I want to draw your attention to. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. Identification and transformation. God identified with humanity, that humanity could be called to identify with God. This is identification and transformation. God assumes humanity, that humanity could be embraced by and assumed by and assumed within God. The incarnation, as explained by Athanasius, is a mission of identification and transformation. Another of the Egyptian fathers representing the tradition is Evagrius of Pontus, Pontus being a city in Egypt. Evagrius identified a list of struggles that were common to all humanity. This list is later adopted and modified slightly by Pope Gregory in approximately 590 AD and comes down to us as those known as the 7 deadly sins. Many have heard of the 7 deadly sins, but may not know, where does this come from? Out of Egypt, I have called my son. They become transformed in the West. They are understood in a different way in the West. In the East, in Egypt, these are understood as areas that are in need of healing. And I need to underscore that word. Healing. These are not sources of guilt demanding punishment. These are areas of malady, of needfulness. This is a list of those aspects of the human experience where the Christian calls out to God as physician. Heal me. Bring me healing. That's what this spiritual tradition is about. It's not about guilt. It's about healing, identification, and transformation. God identifies with humanity, that humanity can be healed to fully identify with God. This tradition is received by Ambrose. Ambrose receives the tradition of Egypt. He receives the tradition of biblical translation. He receives the tradition of the allegorical interpretation of Scripture. He receives the tradition of Athanasius of identification and transformation. And he receives the tradition of the Desert Fathers of spiritual healing. Ambrose is to become the teacher of none other than Augustine. Augustine's writings will come to dominate Christian reflection in Western Europe. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. The Egyptian tradition is passed through these fathers, finding its way to Ambrose and Augustine, and from there to Western Europe. From the cradle of the Christian tradition, it flourishes in Europe. No, Christianity is not a European religion. It is a Near Eastern religion. But out of Egypt, I have called my son. And this tradition was received in Europe. So I just want to sum up my presentation. Reflection on the Christian tradition of Egypt. It reflects the tradition of Bible translation, the Septuagint, the translation of the 70 from the Hebrew to the Greek. The Greek translation becoming the Bible of the authors of the New Testament itself. The Greek translation being the translation that Christians used, not the Hebrew. The tradition of allegorical interpretation of Scripture, the spiritual interpretation of Scripture that finds deeper meanings in the narratives. The tradition of identification and transformation with Athanasius, that God becomes human, and identifying with humanity, that humanity can identify with God. And that within this tradition is the healing of the soul. That the human condition is not about guilt and God ready to smite in wrath, but the human condition is one of malady in need of a healer, and calling out to God with a focus, with a longing to be healed, to be restored to God's intention, God's design. And it's with that I would conclude with, again, the theme of my presentation, Out of Egypt I have called my son. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Any questions? Noon time is racing towards us, and I know everybody has other appointments at 12, so we'll leave here at 12 noon. But any questions that you have? I had two questions for Dr. Robinson, and I have a question for both of them, actually. So if you can jump in before me, or I go first. So I'll go first. For both of you, you mentioned that there were gods, at least 10 of them, numerous, but 10 of them that Jehovah, God of the Bible, hit or smit to show his glory to the ancient Egyptians. Now you say that ancient Egyptians, or the God of Yahweh took some progressively out of Egypt to get us to Christianity. Now, the question for both of you, is there any contamination, quote unquote, from the pagan religions of Egypt, the 10 at least represented in that Yahweh faced or smitten, that transpired into the Jewish to the Christian faith?
Okay. If I understand your question, the question is there some sort of pre-Christian or non-Jewish, non-Christian religion influence that corrupts later Jewish or later Christian tradition?
Yes.
I won't presume to speak for Dr. Robinson, but I can tell you that keeping with the theme of my presentation, the understanding of the Christian tradition as it was received and developed was that the truth is the truth, regardless of its source, regardless of where it comes from. And so if that which is true and good and beautiful in a non-Christian or non-Jewish source can be recognized and affirmed, then not only can it be, but it ought to be. And so the tradition, the Christian tradition, has never been one of exclusiveness and denial of that which is true and good, but always recognition and affirmation that God is the God of all. And anywhere that truth and beauty and goodness can be seen and recognized and affirmed, not only can it be, it should be. And so the Christian tradition, if there are apparent comparisons or likenesses that are carried over, the Christian tradition historically would not say that those are corruptions, but rather a recognition and an affirmation that the God of all has sown seeds of truth and goodness and beauty throughout the whole earth, and those should be affirmed wherever they are to be found.
Something like the light before the sun sets, the dawn, that God was talking to these people about the one God in Akhenaton, or the...
The Christians would simply affirm that it makes more sense that God and echoes or resonances of God's truth would be expected to be seen. They would find it as more reasonable that you would expect to see resonances of God's truth throughout the world than undifferentiated darkness. You would not expect to see undifferentiated darkness. You would expect to see seeds of truth and resonances of that which is true and good and beautiful, and to recognize those where they can be recognized.
So we shouldn't be too worried about the similarities between some in the Book of the Dead and some in the Bible. It's not this copied from those.
Well, there are two strands of tradition, right? There's the tradition that I think what Dr. Robinson was getting at was that certainly the Christian tradition does not deny that it has seen the true light. Mm-hmm. In the Eastern liturgy, it said, "We have seen the true light." Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." And so this is the light that illumines the shadows and the darkness. Where there is error, it is made right. Where there is falsehood, truth is shown forth. So there is the tradition that what must be denied must be denied. But there is the parallel tradition. What must be affirmed can and should be affirmed. And so I don't see that Dr. Robinson and I are at any variance with one another in our comments. Mm-hmm. That Dr. Robinson was getting at, look, there are things that the Christian tradition does deny. Mm-hmm. Polytheism, for example. Mm-hmm. But there are things that the Christian tradition also affirms. That there is a life everlasting. That there is a judgment. That there is a restoration and a reward and a promise of good things. The word gospel is good news. If good news is simply soured as bad news, that doesn't attract us. Christian tradition has always recognized that we're not attracted by vinegar, but by honey.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yes.
How long after the Exodus and the departure of 2.5 million Israelites did polytheism basically fall apart within Egypt? Did it have to wait until the coming of Muhammad?
Well, polytheism certainly survived vigorously and was practiced in Egypt through the centuries A.D. It was, I believe, in the 4th century A.D., there was a quite rowdy uprising in Egypt that resulted in a unfortunate Christian mob sort of attacking and tearing down one of the last remaining major pagan shrines in Egypt. So it remained. In the early Roman Empire, Christianity and quote-unquote pagans or non-Christians, and I want to pause there and point out that there were quote-unquote pagan monotheists. That is to say, there were those who were neither Jewish nor Christian, but were monotheists. Monotheism was there. And so it's not simply polytheism that we're talking about. But it survived. Christians and non-Christians lived with one another. There were persecutions against Christians that punctuated this ability to live with one another. But Christians, as reflected in the New Testament tradition itself, thought of themselves as wishing to live harmoniously in the society in which they found themselves. So these polytheistic religions, these non-Jewish, non-Christian religions did continue. They did survive. But eventually, along with the Christianization of the entirety of the Roman Empire, these gradually faded away, and gradually everyone identified themselves as Christians. There were punctuations to that with some violence, but these were punctuations. This was not the norm. Gradually, there was a more organic transformation and a fading of those other religions.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.